Long before Venice whispered of shadowed deals and unseen power, one man moved silently through its labyrinth of canals and alleys. Antoine Morelli didn't shout for attention. He didn't demand respect. He negotiated it, through subtle gestures, careful observation, and alliances built in silence. Every gondola, every shadowed doorway, every whispered conversation became part of a hidden network he was slowly mastering. Tonight, as the lanterns shimmer on the water and the fog curls beneath the bridges, you will follow him into the quiet heart of Venice, where influence flows like water, invisible yet unstoppable. This is the story of a man who ruled not with force, but with strategy, patience, and the art of silence. Long before the canals whispered of crime and the alleyways of Venice carried the faint scent of deals made in shadow, a man arrived quietly, almost as if he had always belonged to the city. His name was Antoine Morelli, a Venetian by birth but a stranger in his own streets. At first glance, he appeared ordinary, a slender man in a neatly tailored coat, a felt hat pulled low over dark eyes, gloves soft and black as midnight, but there was a rhythm to his movements, a deliberate pacing that hinted at a mind perpetually calculating, perpetually aware. The gondolas rocked gently along the canals, the soft lapping of water against wooden hulls blending with the distant tolling of church bells. Streetlights flickered in the mist rising from the lagoon, creating pools of muted gold on cobblestones slick from the morning rain. It was in this quiet, almost hypnotic atmosphere that Antoine stepped off the water taxi, his leather shoes making almost no sound. Even the city, bustling though it was with merchants, gondoliers, and street hawkers, seemed to pause, or perhaps simply to yield to his presence. Antoine's first hours back in Venice were not spent in grandeur or pomp. He walked the narrow alleyways, observing, cataloging, and absorbing the pulse of his surroundings. A smell of fresh bread from a corner bakery mingled with the faint, briny odor of the canals. Laundry hung from lines above, fluttering in the soft wind. Children ran past, laughing, their bare feet slapping wet stone. This was the city he remembered, yet it was changed. Some buildings bore the scars of years neglected, others gleamed under new ownership. And somewhere amid it all, beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life, the undercurrent of whispered deals and hidden commerce flowed, waiting for someone clever enough to navigate it. Antoine paused at a small café tucked in a shadowed courtyard. The awning was faded, but the aroma of espresso was strong and inviting. He entered without a word, nodding briefly to the bartender, a portly man whose face had long since learned to read the intentions of passers-by. Antoine chose a corner seat, one that allowed him to watch the narrow passage leading from the canal and the door to the street. From this vantage, he could see every customer who entered, every conversation, every subtle exchange of glances. He did not drink the coffee immediately. Instead, he let it sit, allowing the rich aroma to mingle with his thoughts. He had come back not to relive the past, but to shape a future only he could see. Antoine understood, perhaps better than most, that power was rarely claimed with force alone. It was accumulated in layers, a favor here, a well-timed silence there, a smile at the precise moment that suggested trust. In a city as intricate as Venice, with its canals, hidden stairways, and countless eyes always watching, subtlety was a form of currency more valuable than gold. Outside, the city hummed with life. Gondoliers guided their boats through narrow channels, their voices calling softly to each other. Merchants arranged crates of oranges, figs, and spices in the fading light. Children played near the water's edge, unaware of the subtle economy in which their parents participated. Debts settled quietly, arrangements made discreetly, influence traded behind closed doors. Antoine watched, noting who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, and which faces bore the kind of quiet authority that often went unnoticed by casual observers. As he sipped the dark espresso, he began to weave an invisible map of the city in his mind, marking points of contact, potential allies, and subtle threats. He noted the small palazzos where merchants kept their accounts, the hidden docks where boats unloaded crates too discreetly to appear in official ledgers, and the cafes that were less about coffee than the exchange of information. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word could be a thread in a larger tapestry of influence, and Antoine intended to knit it carefully, thread by thread. By late afternoon, he moved from the café into the labyrinth of alleyways that snaked between canal and piazza. Here the city revealed its secret side. Narrow passages led to quiet courtyards where deals took place unseen. Behind velvet curtains and weathered doors, letters were passed, coins exchanged, agreements sealed in whispers. Antoine observed a man, well-dressed yet cautious, exchanging a folded note with a gondolier, who then slipped into the shadows with the subtlety of a cat. Such moments were ordinary, yet to Antoine, each revealed a pattern, a rhythm, a network of dependency that could be mapped and eventually directed. Night fell gently over Venice and the city transformed. Lanterns flickered on stone walls, reflecting in the still canals like stars fallen to earth. The streets were quieter, but the undercurrent persisted, more secretive now, more deliberate. Antoine reached a small palazzo he remembered from his youth, a place of faded grandeur. The front door opened with a soft creak, and inside, the faint scent of aged wood and wax polish greeted him. He moved through the hallways silently, noting the furniture, the portraits, and the subtle wear in the floorboards. Every detail mattered. Every detail was a story, a clue, a key. By midnight, Antoine was back at the canal, seated on a small wooden bench, watching gondolas drift silently beneath the bridges. He allowed himself a rare smile, not of triumph but of quiet satisfaction. The city had welcomed him home in its own subtle, secretive way. Power was not yet his, but the path was visible, laid out in shadows and whispers, in favors and debts, in the silent understanding that in Venice, influence flowed like water, quietly, inevitably, and endlessly. Antoine leaned back, his eyes reflecting the flickering lanterns. He had returned, yes, but not to reclaim something that had been lost. He had come to build, to construct an empire without the noise of gunfire, without the bluster of public authority. The city was his canvas, and he, a quiet artist, would paint it with strategy, patience, and finesse. Each handshake, each exchanged glance, each well-chosen silence would add a stroke. And when the work was complete, Venice would hum with a power invisible to the casual eye, but absolute to those who understood. As the first hints of dawn brushed the horizon with pale gold, Antoine Morelli rose from the bench, his silhouette tall against the quiet canals. The city, bathed in gentle light, seemed to acknowledge his presence. Today he would begin the first true moves of a plan decades in the making. And though the streets would see him only as another man walking among the crowds, the network of Venice would already be bending, subtly, toward his will. And in that quiet moment, the canals whispered his name, not aloud but in the soft, inevitable way of water shaping stone. Antoine Morelli had arrived, silently, and Venice had noticed. The morning fog lay thick over Venice, curling around the stone bridges and winding through the alleyways like a secret. Antoine Morelli stepped onto the damp cobblestones, his coat brushing lightly against the mist. He had spent the night in silent observation, cataloging faces, gestures, and patterns of movement, and now the city appeared more alive to him than ever. The hum of commerce was beginning to swell, but beneath it, the undertone of clandestine deals persisted. It was in these quiet undercurrents that Antoine had learned, and would continue to learn, the true art of influence. He walked toward a small canal-side café, one that had not changed much since his youth. Its faded green awning creaked in the wind, and the aroma of strong coffee drifted out to the street. Antoine entered without a word, nodding to the familiar bartender, whose eyes flicked with recognition. The café was a crossroads of Venice's quieter commerce. Merchants discussing shipments in hushed tones, gondoliers exchanging information with subtle gestures, and occasional outsiders who moved through the space with purpose but without recognition. Antoine chose a corner table, one that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Here he could observe without being observed, a fundamental skill he had honed over years of careful practice. He ordered espresso and waited, letting the rhythmic clinking of cups, the soft murmur of conversation, and the occasional laughter of passing patrons blend into the background. Each sound, each glance, each nod was a thread in the tapestry he was beginning to weave. Within an hour, a man entered the café who seemed to exist almost apart from the bustle. He was tall, with hair like polished chestnut and eyes sharp enough to make anyone uneasy. Antoine recognized him immediately, Lorenzo Bellini, a local merchant with interests in imported goods, who had long been rumored to facilitate discreet transfers for those who preferred transactions away from the prying eyes of authorities. Bellini's reputation was subtle but formidable. He had influence not through wealth alone but through the intricate network he controlled, a lattice of favors and debts that Antoine had been tracking in his mental map of the city. Antoine raised a hand, and Bellini approached with a measured gait, acknowledging the unspoken familiarity between them. "Antoine," Bellini said softly, taking a seat opposite him. "I heard you returned to Venice." "Yes," Antoine replied, his voice calm, almost deliberately unassuming. "I've been away too long. Venice changes while one sleeps, but some patterns remain." Bellini's eyes flicked toward the canal visible through the café window, then back to Antoine. You mean the patterns that people ignore? The ones that matter most? Antoine allowed a faint smile. Exactly. The conversation moved easily, almost innocuously, but beneath each word, a careful calculation unfolded. Antoine spoke of shipments, minor disputes and minor opportunities in ways that appeared casual to any eavesdropper. Bellini responded in kind, offering hints, veiled suggestions, and testing the waters for Antoine's reactions. Each exchange was a maneuver, a probing of territory and intention. By midday, Antoine had secured his first informal understanding, a subtle arrangement to facilitate certain shipments along quieter canals, with Bellini providing protection in exchange for small favors to be determined later. Nothing official, nothing binding on paper, only the delicate trust that Venice's underworld demanded. Antoine had learned long ago that influence could be more powerful than contracts, and patience more potent than threats. After the meeting, Antoine stepped outside into the brightening afternoon. The mist had lifted, revealing the city's full splendor, the soft shimmer of sunlight on the water, gondolas gliding silently under arched bridges, merchants arranging their goods, and the occasional tourist, oblivious to the hidden network threading the city together. Antoine walked slowly, noting a young gondolier who had watched the café entrance more than once. A nod exchanged discreetly would be enough. Antoine did not need more at this stage. The boy would become part of the network, unwittingly, naturally. In the following days, Antoine visited additional cafés, palazzos and marketplaces. Each place revealed a nuance, each person a potential ally or liability. He spoke to gondoliers who moved crates with the skill of artists, noting which ones had been entrusted with delicate cargo before. He observed merchants who conducted small exchanges without raising suspicion. Even the servants who moved silently through grand houses offered insights, if one knew how to notice. Every detail, however minor, was a stitch in the web Antoine was crafting. One evening, Antoine found himself on a bridge overlooking the Grand Canal, watching the city as lanterns flickered against the evening fog. The reflections danced on the water like fleeting promises, ephemeral yet full of significance. Antoine's mind wandered over the day's interactions, the subtle agreements, the whispered acknowledgments, the delicate balance of trust and leverage. This was his craft, silent, unassuming, yet infinitely precise. By nightfall, he had identified 3 key allies for potential competitors, and a dozen opportunities where influence could grow silently, invisibly, without drawing attention. This meticulous mapping was not just about commerce. It was about establishing a rhythm, a flow of power that would ripple outward across the city without ever breaking the surface. Before retiring for the night, Antoine paused at a small dock where a lone gondolier polished his boat. The boy looked up, curious. Antoine handed him a coin, not as a bribe, but as a gesture of recognition. "Keep your eyes open," Antoine said softly. "The city speaks if one listens." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, yet feeling the weight in Antoine's calm tone. Small gestures like these, subtle yet deliberate, would compound over time. Venice had a long memory, and Antoine intended to leave an impression that could not be erased. As he walked back to his quarters, Antoine felt the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. No confrontation, no violence, no spectacle. Only observation, understanding, and carefully placed influence. This was the way of Venice, the way of the city that thrived in shadows and whispers. And Antoine Morelli, patient, precise, and observant, was beginning to claim his place within it. The night closed softly around him, the faint sound of gondolas and distant laughter blending into the darkness. In the quiet, Antoine knew he had taken the first true steps toward something far greater than a mere network of commerce. He had begun to construct an empire, one quiet conversation, one discreet favor, one observation at a time. And in Venice, power, like water, always found its way. Venice awoke slowly, the morning light glancing off the water in muted streaks of gold and gray. Antoine Morelli moved deliberately through the labyrinth of canals, each step measured, each breath attuned to the rhythm of the city. The fog of early dawn hung low, curling around the bridges and creeping through narrow alleyways, concealing secrets that only those who knew how to watch could discern. Antoine knew them all. Or at least he knew enough to begin. He had spent the past days observing, mapping, and cataloging. Now it was time for action. The first true move in a plan that would eventually weave an empire from whispered agreements and invisible influence. He had arranged to meet a supplier, a man who transported goods discreetly through Venice's hidden channels, bypassing the official docks and the watchful eyes of inspectors. His name was Marco Vieri, a broad-shouldered man with a reputation for reliability, though not always for discretion. Antoine had watched him from a distance, noting the way he maneuvered his boat, the careful glances he gave certain streets, and the subtle signals he used to communicate with his associates. Antoine approached the small dock where Marco waited, the wood creaking softly underfoot. The early morning was quiet, save for the faint splash of water against the hulls of moored gondolas. Marco's eyes flicked to Antoine and he offered a curt nod. No words were needed, the city's rhythm spoke for them both. "Antoine," Marco said, his voice low but firm. "You want the shipment moved through the smaller canals, yes? Avoiding the main routes." "Yes," Antoine replied, keeping his tone casual, almost conversational. "And you understand the importance of discretion. Timing is crucial." Marco grunted, acknowledging both the request and the unspoken implications. He knew the risks as did Antoine, but neither spoke of them openly. In Venice, contracts were often made with a handshake, a nod, or a glance rather than ink and paper. Antoine preferred it that way. The subtleties of human understanding were far more binding than any written agreement. The two men moved to the boat, stepping carefully onto the narrow deck. Antoine observed the layout: crates stacked neatly, ropes coiled with precision, and a small compartment in the stern designed for particularly sensitive cargo. The arrangement was simple yet elegant in its practicality. Every detail was considered, every risk mitigated. Antoine's mind catalogued each element, already envisioning how it would integrate into the broader network he was constructing. As they navigated through the narrower canals, Antoine spoke sparingly, allowing Marco to take the lead. The city passed silently, lanterns flickering, their reflections rippling across the water's surface. Small bridges arched overhead, and the occasional figure leaned from a balcony, observing with curiosity or indifference. Antoine noted everything: the patterns of traffic, the occasional guard on a distant bridge, the way the water flowed at different tides. Knowledge, he knew, was currency. The more one understood, the more one controlled. Midway through the journey, Marco paused at a secluded dock, one Antoine had marked as a potential meeting point in his mental map of the city. A small group awaited, 2 men and a woman, all dressed with careful attention to appearance, as though even subtle signs could betray intention. Antoine's eyes swept over them, noting their posture, the slight tension in their hands, the way their eyes measured his every movement. "Delivery is clean," Marco said simply. "No interruptions, no questions." "As agreed." The woman stepped forward, her movements precise and unassuming, yet with an elegance that made her presence commanding. "Antoine Morelli," she said softly, "the city has been expecting someone like you." Her tone was neither warm nor cold, merely factual, but it carried weight. She handed him a small, folded note, sealed with wax. Antoine accepted it, noting the seal's intricate design. The note contained instructions, details of further exchanges, subtle signals, and a set of contacts he had yet to meet. Every element was designed to test him, to gauge his understanding of Venice's silent rules. Antoine did not flinch. He had anticipated as much. With a nod, he pocketed the note, acknowledging both the instruction and the challenge. The delivery completed, Marco guided the boat back along the hidden canals, avoiding main routes with practiced ease. Antoine remained quiet, absorbing every detail: the glint of early morning on water, the way shadows moved under bridges, the faint scent of salt and earth mingling in the air. Each sensory note was a piece of intelligence, each observation a strategic advantage. By the time they returned to the main canal, Antoine had begun to sketch the outlines of his next moves. The arrangement with Marco was only the first of many. Soon he would integrate gondoliers, merchants, and even seemingly inconsequential figures into a web that would extend across Venice. Each person, each action, each small favor returned would become a link in a chain of influence, unseen by outsiders, yet strong and binding to those within. Later that evening, Antoine met with another contact, a modestly dressed clerk who managed accounts for several influential merchants. Their meeting took place in a quiet office overlooking a small canal, illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps. Antoine reviewed ledgers, asked seemingly innocuous questions, and listened more than he spoke. In the rhythm of the discussion he discerned patterns: who held debts, who owed favors, which shipments were likely to bypass official channels. Every detail strengthened his understanding of the city's undercurrent. By midnight, Antoine returned to his quarters, the canal silent and still beneath the starlit sky. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The first arrangement had been executed flawlessly. The network had begun to take shape, subtle and intricate, yet already extending beyond immediate perception. He had not drawn attention, had not used threats or force. Power, Antoine reflected, was a slow accumulation, a careful orchestration of relationships, trust, and timing. In the quiet of his room, he traced the map of the city with his finger, marking docks, palazzos, and cafes he would revisit. Each location represented opportunity, each individual a potential ally, competitor, or conduit for influence. The city was alive with possibility, and Antoine Morelli was poised to navigate it with patience, precision, and finesse. As he leaned back in the soft chair, the distant sound of water lapping against hulls filled the room, a gentle reminder that Venice moved always silently, and that those who understood its rhythm could direct its flow. Antoine closed his eyes, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a day well executed. The first true step had been taken. The canals whispered in response, subtle and eternal, as though recognizing that a new player had arrived, and that he would move with the calm inevitability of water shaping stone. The morning mist lingered longer than usual that day, curling through the narrow alleys and drifting along the canals like a living thing. Antoine Morelli moved with deliberate calm, his eyes scanning the waterways and stone bridges, noting the early movements of gondoliers, merchants, and the occasional passerby. He had begun to understand the intricate rhythm of Venice, the subtle flows of influence, favors, and information that moved beneath the surface of ordinary life. Today he would start weaving himself directly into that flow. Antoine made his way to a small dock on the quieter side of the city, where the less conspicuous gondoliers moored their boats. These men were the unseen arteries of Venice, moving goods, messages, and sometimes secrets with a skill that made their work appear effortless. Antoine approached a young gondolier, no older than 20, whose eyes held both curiosity and the faint glint of ambition. "You know the canals?" Antoine said softly, leaning on the edge of the dock. "You know how to move without being noticed." The gondolier nodded, tightening his grip on the oar. "I know Venice better than anyone, sir. What do you need?" Antoine allowed a small smile. "I need discretion. And the ability to be everywhere without leaving a trace. Do you understand?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, but his posture remained steady. "I understand," he said. This was the first step in a network that Antoine intended to grow across Venice. The canals were more than mere waterways, they were veins through which information, power, and opportunity flowed. To control them required subtlety, patience, and above all, an understanding of the people who navigated them daily. Antoine had already begun to map their movements in his mind, noting which gondoliers could be trusted, which merchants had hidden connections, and which paths were least observed by the city's authorities. As the day progressed, Antoine moved between docks, marketplaces, and shadowed cafes, speaking in hushed tones, nodding where words were unnecessary and listening more than he spoke. Every interaction revealed a pattern: a merchant who trusted a particular gondolier, a clerk who kept meticulous yet exploitable records, a street cleaner who noticed every unusual delivery. Antoine catalogued it all, each detail a thread in the web he was building. By late afternoon he orchestrated his first small operation using the young gondolier. A shipment of fine textiles, ostensibly for a merchant in the Rialto market, would instead be transported discreetly through a hidden canal, avoiding inspection and observation. Antoine had arranged every detail: the time of departure, the route, the signals to be used at each bridge, and the subtle coordination with other intermediaries. The gondolier moved like a shadow, gliding along the water, silent and precise. Antoine followed at a discreet distance, observing how the network of human and environmental cues guided the operation. At each critical juncture, a narrow bridge, a converging canal, a lightly patrolled quay, he noted the ease with which his plan unfolded. Venice had revealed herself willingly, providing pathways, opportunities, and the occasional obstacle to test his foresight. That evening, as the sun dipped behind distant palazzos, Antoine returned to a small café overlooking a quiet canal. He met with an associate of Marco Vieri, a man who managed minor accounts and transactions for the network of merchants Antoine was beginning to influence. Over espresso, the man handed Antoine a ledger, not bound or locked but carefully organized. Within it were the subtle patterns of commerce, recurring shipments, favored routes, and the occasional irregularity hinting at unreported activity. Antoine examined the pages, committing names, faces, and routes to memory. By nightfall, Antoine had identified potential points of leverage: a clerk who could lose a shipment for a favor, a gondolier who could deliver messages unobserved, a merchant who would owe him gratitude for a subtle correction of a minor dispute. The city itself seemed pliable to his vision, a network waiting for a skilled navigator to direct its flow. However, not all was quiet. In the shadows of a narrow alley, Antoine noticed a figure observing him. A man of medium build, dressed in muted tones, eyes keen and calculating. Antoine recognized immediately the look of someone accustomed to watching, weighing, and waiting for opportunity. It was an early warning, a subtle reminder that power was never uncontested, even in seemingly small operations. Antoine did not flinch. He had anticipated opposition as any careful strategist would. He allowed the man to continue observing, noting every detail, every minor gesture. Returning to his quarters, Antoine reflected on the day's progress. The first real movements of his network were underway. The young gondolier had proven capable, the shipments had moved unnoticed, and the subtle influence over merchants and clerks had begun to take hold. Yet the presence of the watcher reminded him that Venice's undercurrents were never simple. Every step forward required caution, observation, and the readiness to adjust. Antoine's mind wandered as he looked out over the canal from his window. Lanterns reflected in the rippling water, casting patterns that shifted with each small wave. The city was alive, whispering secrets to those who could listen. Antoine Morelli had begun to listen in earnest. The canals, the docks, the hidden alleyways, all were now threads in his growing tapestry of influence. And in Venice, influence, like water, could move quietly but unstoppable, shaping the city in ways invisible to the casual observer. That night, as the city slept or pretended to, Antoine mapped the day's discoveries meticulously. Each individual, each pathway, each hidden route was a note in the symphony he was beginning to conduct. The canals had offered him their first tangible advantages, and he intended to expand upon them methodically, strategically, and without drawing attention. Venice would yield its secrets to him, as it had always yielded to those patient enough to understand its subtle rhythms. By the time he extinguished the lamp beside his desk, Antoine felt a quiet satisfaction. The first connections were in place, the first network threads woven, and the first challenges noted. The city was beginning to respond, its hidden veins aligning with his plan. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Venice had always been a city of intrigue, commerce, and quiet power. Now, quietly, Antoine Morelli was becoming a part of its heartbeat. The canals of Venice were quieter than usual that morning, shrouded in a pale mist that softened the edges of stone bridges and palazzi. Antoine Morelli walked along the narrow pathways, his footsteps muffled against the wet cobblestones. The city seemed to breathe around him, subtle and deliberate, like a living organism attuned to its own rhythms. Today, Antoine knew, would require careful attention. A challenge was already brewing, one that demanded tact, patience, and the quiet application of influence. He had noticed the observer the previous evening, a man of medium build, sharply dressed, with eyes that measured everything. Antoine had not confronted him. Instead, he had catalogued every detail: the man's gait, the direction of his glances, the slight tension in his hands. The city's subtle currents had shifted in response to this new presence, and Antoine understood that the true danger was not the man himself, but the networks he represented. Power, after all, was rarely wielded alone. Antoine paused at a small café, one perched at the corner of a canal rarely patrolled by guards. The awning, worn yet welcoming, sheltered a handful of early customers. Merchants discussing shipments, gondoliers negotiating rates, and the occasional clerk scribbling notes into ledgers. Antoine chose a secluded corner, allowing his eyes to drift over each figure, each gesture, each whispered exchange. In Venice, understanding the silent language of the city was more valuable than the sharpest dagger or the loudest proclamation. The man appeared again. From a distance, Antoine observed him pause, nod at a gondolier, and then retreat into the shadows. This was no casual wanderer. He was mapping, testing, probing for weaknesses. Antoine recognized the pattern. The city was a chessboard, and each person, each path, each small gesture could serve as a piece in the larger game. Today, Antoine intended to respond, not with force but with precision. He left the café and moved along the quieter canals, heading toward a small warehouse he had previously identified as a meeting point for trusted intermediaries. Inside, crates of textiles, spices, and other valuable goods were stacked with meticulous care. A few familiar faces awaited him: the young gondolier, Marco Vieri's associate, and a clerk who had quietly provided key insights into merchant operations. Their presence, though seemingly ordinary, was a thread Antoine could manipulate to reinforce his growing network. Antoine outlined the first subtle measures to assert influence over the canal's flow. Shipments would be rerouted slightly, creating opportunities to observe and identify rival movements. Minor favors would be distributed to trusted intermediaries, each gesture signaling loyalty without creating visible debt. The young gondolier was assigned to observe certain bridges, noting unusual activity. Every individual played a role, and Antoine carefully aligned them like instruments in a symphony, ensuring that each note contributed to a broader harmony of control. Yet the observer remained, like a shadow drifting through the city's edges. Antoine knew that a direct confrontation would reveal weakness. Instead, he orchestrated a small demonstration of control. A shipment was moved precisely along a hidden canal, arriving at its destination with flawless timing. To any casual observer, it was a routine delivery. To those attuned to the city's rhythms, however, it was a signal. Antoine Morelli was aware, prepared, and capable. By evening, Antoine convened a discreet meeting in a dimly lit palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. The flicker of oil lamps cast elongated shadows across the walls, and the soft murmur of water below created a serene backdrop. The gondolier and the clerk were present, along with a new contact, a merchant who had previously resisted subtle influence but was now open to a delicate arrangement. Antoine spoke with calm authority, laying out expectations, incentives, and boundaries. No threats were necessary. The weight of his strategic understanding carried its own power. The evening deepened, and the city outside seemed to respond. Lanterns reflected in the rippling water, shadows lengthened, and the soft murmur of gondolas passing beneath bridges created a gentle rhythm. Antoine's mind catalogued each interaction, each gesture, each subtle acknowledgement of trust or hesitation. He was building not merely a network of transactions, but a lattice of loyalty, observation, and influence that would be invisible to those not attuned to its patterns. As night settled fully over Venice, Antoine returned to his quarters. He reviewed the day's outcomes, noting minor adjustments, potential risks, and opportunities for further influence. The observer had not revealed himself, but Antoine was not concerned. In Venice, patience was a weapon as potent as any blade. The city itself moved with a rhythm that could be anticipated, and Antoine had already begun to learn its cadences. Before retiring, Antoine paused by his window, looking out over the still waters of the canal. The reflection of the palazzos danced lightly on the surface, shifting with the gentle flow of water. He allowed himself a moment of quiet contemplation. Each subtle action, each carefully placed word, each observation had brought him closer to an understanding of Venice few could claim. Power here was silent, patient, cumulative. It was the art of anticipation, of influence, and of knowing when to act and when to remain still. The day had been a test, a subtle challenge from both the city and the unseen rival. Antoine had met it with calm, strategy, and a keen understanding of the delicate interplay of people, information, and opportunity. The canals whispered in response, an echo of approval or perhaps acknowledgement, and Antoine knew that the first real measure of influence was now in motion. Venice had many watchers, many players, but Antoine Morelli had begun to move through the city's hidden veins with a quiet inevitability. The art of silence, he reflected, was more powerful than the loudest proclamation. And in the quiet, subtle power of observation and influence, Antoine was learning to become not just a participant in the city, but its unseen architect. The morning light fell pale over Venice, diffused through a thin layer of mist that curled around the stone facades of palazzos lining the Grand Canal. Antoine Morelli adjusted his coat as he walked along the narrow quay, every step deliberate, every glance measuring the subtle cues of the city. Venice was not just a network of canals and commerce, it was a theater of influence, where alliances were forged in whispered conversations behind carved doors, and power was often held by those who never raised their voices. Today, Antoine's path would take him deeper into the world he had been quietly navigating. He had secured his initial network of gondoliers and merchants, and shipments now flowed with the precision he had orchestrated. But Venice's true influence extended beyond the canals. It resided within the palazzos, in the offices of minor nobles, and in the corridors where clerks and councilmen whispered decisions that shaped commerce and law alike. To expand his reach, Antoine would need to engage in the delicate dance of politics, subtlety, and perception. He arrived at a grand palazzo, its stone facade adorned with intricate carvings and faded frescoes hinting at centuries of wealth and prestige. A single lantern glimmered in the doorway as a doorman, recognizing Antoine from previous visits, nodded silently. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and aged parchment. Antoine's footsteps echoed softly as he moved through the hallways, each one lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to observe every intruder with judgment or curiosity. At a modestly lit drawing room, a meeting had been arranged with a minor councilman, Paolo Ricci, and an influential merchant, Isabella Conti. Both were figures who commanded respect, not through open power, but through subtle influence over trade licenses, transport approvals, and the delicate balance of favors in Venice's intricate social web. Antoine entered with calm authority, offering nods instead of handshakes, allowing the weight of his presence to communicate his intentions. "Antoine," Paolo said, his voice measured, "Venice is a city of subtle currents. You seem to have learned its rhythms." Antoine inclined his head slightly. "I have returned to observe, to understand, and to participate where discretion is valued over force." Isabella regarded him with a faint, assessing smile. "Force is seldom necessary here. Influence, patience, and understanding, these are the currencies of our city." The conversation was formal, courteous, yet every word was layered. Antoine spoke of minor disputes among merchants, proposed subtle arrangements for trade routes, and hinted at improvements that would benefit all parties involved. Nothing was promised outright. Instead, each suggestion was a test, a measure of trust and comprehension. Paolo and Isabella responded in kind, offering observations and small concessions, gauging Antoine's intentions and reactions. By mid-afternoon, Antoine had secured tentative agreements. Small concessions in trade, discreet favors that would expand his network, and introductions to additional influential figures who could further his reach. Each agreement was fragile, maintained only by the unspoken understanding that discretion and reciprocity were essential. In Venice, overt displays of ambition were often met with resistance, but subtle accumulation of influence was welcomed by those who recognized skill and foresight. After the meeting, Antoine took a solitary walk along the canal outside the palazzo. Gondolas drifted past, their occupants absorbed in private conversations or silent observation. The soft sound of oars slicing through water created a rhythm that mirrored Antoine's thoughts, measured, deliberate, and unhurried. He catalogued the results of the meeting in his mind, noting potential allies, emerging threats, and the subtle shifts in influence that each interaction had produced. The evening brought an unexpected visitor, the observer Antoine had noticed in the previous days. This time, the man approached openly, introducing himself as Lorenzo Gatti, a merchant with interests across multiple districts. Gatti's reputation was subtle but formidable. He had long been aware of the movements of others, assessing opportunities and weaknesses alike. Antoine listened carefully as Gatti outlined his observations, not with hostility, but with curiosity and an implicit offer of collaboration. Antoine assessed the proposition silently. Gatti's insight could be valuable, yet the alliance had to be measured. "Your observations are noted," Antoine said softly, "and Venice rewards those who understand the city's currents. Perhaps we can find mutual benefit in the proper measures." By nightfall, Antoine had woven the day's meetings, observations, and exchanges into his mental map of Venice's social and commercial landscape. Each palazzo, each merchant, each councilman was a node in a network of influence that stretched far beyond the canals. He had established contacts, tested loyalties, and subtly asserted his presence within the city's higher echelons. Returning to his quarters, Antoine paused to gaze out over the water, lantern reflections shimmering on the gentle ripples. The city was alive with quiet power, each individual performing their role in a dance of discretion, subtlety, and negotiation. Antoine understood that true control was rarely overt. It was earned through patience, observation, and strategic placement within the invisible web that connected Venice's commerce, politics, and social hierarchy. As he prepared for rest, Antoine allowed himself a rare moment of contemplation. The palazzo meetings had reinforced an essential lesson. Influence extended beyond visible transactions. To shape Venice, he would need to master not only the flow of goods along the canals, but the flow of decisions within council rooms, the sway of opinions among merchants, and the unspoken allegiances of families with power embedded over generations. The city offered opportunities, but only to those who understood its rhythm and acted with foresight. That night, as the canals whispered beneath the bridges, Antoine Morelli reflected on the delicate balance of power he was beginning to command. Each alliance, each agreement, each subtle observation brought him closer to a silent mastery of Venice. A mastery built not with force but with patience, intelligence, and an unwavering understanding of the art of subtle influence. And in the quiet, gentle night, Venice acknowledged him as it would continue to do, only to those capable of listening to its hidden voice. The fog rolled in thick over Venice that evening, curling around the canal bridges and alleyways like a ghostly veil. Antoine Morelli walked deliberately through the dimly lit streets, his coat brushing against the damp walls. The city was quieter now, the usual bustle muted by the early winter chill, but Antoine knew that silence rarely meant security. Somewhere in the shadows, unseen observers moved with purpose, measuring, waiting, testing the waters. He had felt it before, of course, the subtle tension that accompanies those who tread in spaces where influence and commerce intertwine, but tonight it was sharper, more deliberate. A whisper had reached him earlier in the day, a rumor of shipments diverted, favors withheld, and subtle threats made in passing. Someone was challenging him, not directly, not yet, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Antoine paused near a narrow bridge, leaning lightly on the railing, letting his eyes trace the faint reflections of lanterns across the rippling water. He catalogued every detail, the gondolier passing silently beneath him, the soft rustle of laundry from a distant balcony, the muted footsteps of a figure moving carefully through a shadowed alley. Each observation was data, each movement a clue. Venice did not reveal its secrets to the careless, but Antoine had learned to see what others overlooked. The first indication of the challenge came in a seemingly innocuous package left at his usual dockside cafe. Wrapped in brown paper, it contained a single folded note. Not all currents flow as you expect. Choose your allies wisely. No signature, no mark, only the subtle threat and a reminder that even careful observation had limits. Antoine did not flinch. He had anticipated that someone would test him eventually. Venice was too intricate, too layered, for power to go unchallenged. He returned to his quarters to examine the message. By candlelight he considered the possibilities. The handwriting was deliberate but untraceable, the paper ordinary, the ink unremarkable. It was meant to provoke thought, to unsettle, but not to disclose intent. Antoine smiled faintly, acknowledging the silent duel. In Venice, contests of power were rarely fought with noise. They unfolded in whispers, gestures, and invisible maneuvers, and Antoine had always preferred the quiet art of anticipation. The next day he set out to uncover the source. He revisited key intermediaries, gondoliers, merchants, clerks, asking seemingly casual questions, noting reactions and watching for inconsistencies. Every answer, every hesitation, every glance added a piece to the puzzle. He observed a particular gondolier, normally reliable, whose route that morning deviated subtly from routine. Antoine noted the slight tension in the man's shoulders, the furtive glance at the corner where two merchants met. The network of Venice, always intricate, was beginning to reveal its threads to him. By afternoon, Antoine had narrowed the circle of suspicion to a handful of potential rivals, men who had both the means and motive to challenge his growing influence. But confronting them directly would be premature, potentially exposing his own vulnerabilities. Instead, he chose to act indirectly, reinforcing loyalty among his allies, subtly demonstrating his awareness, and planting a quiet suggestion of consequence for those who might act against him. Influence, after all, was both carrot and stick, and the city responded to both in nuanced ways. A meeting was arranged that evening at a palazzo long known for discreet gatherings of merchants and minor nobles. Antoine arrived early, allowing the room to settle around him. Candles flickered along the walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across ornate furnishings. Slowly his contacts arrived, gondoliers, merchants, clerks, and even Lorenzo Gatti, the observer who had previously approached him. Each greeted him with the measured courtesy of those who recognized both his presence and his discretion. Antoine guided the conversation subtly, weaving the narrative of loyalty, opportunity, and mutual benefit. He did not mention the note, did not name the threat, yet every word was chosen to reinforce trust and to signal awareness. He praised diligence, acknowledged discretion, and outlined potential arrangements that would reward those aligned with his vision. The message was clear. Antoine Morelli saw the currents, understood the risks, and positioned himself as both protector and orchestrator of opportunity. By nightfall, Venice's canals reflected the lanterns like molten gold, the water shimmering with every ripple. Antoine left the palazzo with a calm mind, aware that the first significant challenge to his influence had been addressed without confrontation. The note, the deviation of a gondolier, the subtle probes from unseen rivals, all were pieces of a complex pattern. Antoine had responded not with force, but with strategy, patience, and the quiet assertion of authority. As he walked past the quiet docks, he paused to observe the flow of commerce and the movements of his network. Every shipment that arrived safely, every favor returned, every glance exchanged between allies was another affirmation that influence could be both silent and absolute. Venice, in all its intricate beauty and peril, was revealing itself to him, thread by thread, and he was prepared to navigate its hidden currents with precision. That night, Antoine mapped the day's discoveries, noting minor adjustments to routes, reinforcing alliances, and identifying the subtle signals that would allow him to anticipate further challenges. The city had tested him, and he had passed not through bold action, but through the quiet application of intelligence, observation, and measured influence. In the solitude of his quarters, Antoine allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The challenge had been real, subtle, and potentially dangerous, but he had met it on his terms. Venice responded not to the loudest voice or the sharpest blade, but to the patient, observant hand that understood its rhythms. And Antoine Morelli, calm, precise, and unwavering, had begun to master those rhythms, quietly shaping the currents that would define the city's underworld for years to come. As the faint sounds of gondolas echoed beneath the bridges and the distant clatter of a closing shutter resonated through the alleyways, Antoine Morelli leaned back and allowed the silence to settle around him. Power, he knew, was not seized in moments of spectacle, but accrued in the quiet, deliberate orchestration of people, opportunities, and perception. Tonight, Venice had whispered its secrets and Antoine had listened, and acted, in the shadows. The night descended over Venice with a hushed grace, wrapping the canals in a thick, silvered fog. Lanterns flickered along the stone bridges, their reflections rippling in the still waters below. Antoine Morelli moved deliberately through the shadowed streets, aware of every step, every sound, every subtle shift in the city's rhythm. The previous days had proven that influence was not a commodity to be claimed with force, but a current to be navigated with patience and precision. Tonight, Antoine intended to expand that current, quietly, invisibly, inexorably. He began his evening at a secluded café, a dimly lit establishment known to a select few as a place where deals could be discussed in whispers and gestures rather than words. The aroma of roasted coffee beans mingled with the briny scent of the canal, creating a sensory tapestry that Antoine had learned to read as carefully as any ledger. His gaze swept the room, noting familiar faces, merchants, gondoliers, clerks, all pieces in the delicate lattice of influence he had been weaving. A soft knock at the door preceded the arrival of a new contact, Vittorio Bellandi, a merchant whose operations had long skirted official scrutiny. His reputation for discretion was nearly unmatched, and Antoine had sought him out deliberately, knowing that Vittorio could serve as a critical node in the network now expanding across Venice. "Antoine," Vittorio said, inclining his head in a gesture of formal respect. "The canals speak of you. Some with curiosity, others with caution." Antoine's eyes met his, calm but discerning. Curiosity and caution are the companions of influence. Both are useful, if you understand how to use them. The conversation moved subtly, layered with meaning. Antoine spoke of opportunities and mutual benefits, of minor adjustments to shipping routes, and of contingencies in the event of unexpected observation. He offered nothing overtly binding, but every suggestion was crafted to ensure alignment, trust, and a tacit acknowledgement of his growing authority. Vittorio listened, responding with measured nods, careful observations, and questions designed to test Antoine's understanding of the city's intricate flows. By the time they parted, Antoine had secured Vittorio's cooperation, a key addition to his growing network. He walked along the canals beneath the pale glow of lanterns, cataloging the evening's interactions. Each handshake, each glance, each subtle acknowledgement was a thread woven into the larger fabric of influence he was constructing. The city itself seemed to respond, the water beneath the bridges reflecting not only light, but the silent, shifting currents of power. Further into the night, Antoine moved toward a narrow alley where a shipment awaited transport through hidden canals. The operation had been planned with meticulous care. Timing, coordination, and discretion were paramount. The young gondolier, who had proven himself in earlier tasks, was ready, poised with an understanding of both route and signal. As the gondola slipped silently into the shadows of the canal, Antoine observed from a distance. Each movement, each subtle adjustment of oars, each cautious glance toward potential observers was executed with precision. The shipment, seemingly ordinary, carried significance. Letters, ledgers, and delicate merchandise that would solidify alliances and reveal potential vulnerabilities among merchants who had previously operated independently. In the darkness, Antoine noted a subtle irregularity. A gondolier from a rival network had entered the path of the operation, lingering in a way that suggested observation rather than transport. Antoine remained calm, cataloging the presence as data rather than threat. Influence, he reminded himself, was cumulative. One misstep need not derail a carefully orchestrated plan if one remained patient, aware, and responsive. By midnight, the shipment had reached its destination without incident, and Antoine returned to a small palazzo where several of his trusted associates had gathered. Candles cast long shadows against the walls, reflecting the flickering of lanterns on the water outside. The room was quiet, the participants aware of the stakes yet trusting in Antoine's measured direction. The evening was spent reinforcing agreements, discussing contingencies, and subtly reminding all involved that influence was a currency that required maintenance. Antoine never raised his voice, never made overt threats. His authority was communicated through observation, subtle affirmation, and the quiet weight of his understanding of the city's rhythms. As he left the palazzo, Antoine paused on a bridge, looking down at the gently rippling water. The reflections of lanterns shimmered like gold, and the faint sounds of gondolas in the distance blended with the occasional murmur of the city's quieter residents. The night was a living entity, one that moved with currents of opportunity, secrecy, and potential. Antoine's presence, though discreet, had begun to shape those currents in ways that were imperceptible to all but the most attentive observers. Back in his quarters, Antoine reviewed the day and night's operations in meticulous detail. Each route, each contact, each subtle interaction had been noted, catalogued, and integrated into his mental map of Venice. The challenge posed by his unseen rival had not diminished. Indeed, it had sharpened his focus and strengthened his strategy. In Venice, power was rarely obvious, but it was cumulative, persistent, and unrelenting for those capable of navigating its depths. Finally, as the city slept under a misted sky, Antoine allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The networks were expanding, influence was solidifying, and subtle challenges were being met with strategy rather than confrontation. Venice was yielding its secrets slowly, deliberately, in whispers and glances, and Antoine Morelli was listening, and acting, in the shadows. The night passed quietly, but the city's pulse was unmistakable. Each gondola, each quiet conversation, each gentle ripple of water carried with it the weight of potential. Antoine knew that true mastery would not come from bold gestures or displays of force, but from the patient, deliberate orchestration of people, information, and perception. And in the hush of Venice's canals, Antoine Morelli was already learning to command the currents that would define the city's hidden world. The morning fog lingered over Venice, heavier than usual, clinging to the canal walls and weaving between the bridges like an invisible shroud. Antoine Morelli walked along the familiar paths, each step deliberate, each glance meticulous. The city had been quiet, too quiet, and he had learned that such silence often preceded a test. The subtle threat from the previous days, the note, the unexpected observer, the deviation of a gondolier from routine, had grown into a pattern. Someone was probing the edges of his growing influence, testing his networks, measuring his reach. It was time for Antoine to confront this challenge not with force, but with strategy. Venice rewarded precision, patience, and subtlety. Antoine intended to demonstrate all three. He began at a small dock where the young gondolier waited, eyes alert and posture tense. Antoine gave a brief nod, signaling that the day's movements would be more than routine. The gondolier understood immediately. They would execute a controlled delivery, but along a route chosen to observe rather than conceal. Every bridge, every corner, every shadow would be monitored for signs of interference. As the gondola glided silently through the hidden canals, Antoine's mind catalogued every detail: the angle of lantern light on the water, the muffled sound of distant footsteps, the occasional ripple of a passing boat. Venice was alive with subtle currents, each one carrying information, opportunity, or risk. Antoine noted them all, integrating each observation into the mental map that had been forming over weeks. Midway through the journey, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man broad-shouldered, moving with quiet intent. Antoine recognized him instantly, a rival merchant known for manipulating shipments, disrupting competitors, and leveraging influence through intimidation. The man's appearance was deliberate, a test designed to gauge Antoine's reaction and readiness. Antoine remained calm. He had anticipated confrontation. He gestured subtly to the gondolier, who adjusted course just enough to maintain discretion without alarming the rival. The shipment moved past, unimpeded, while Antoine catalogued the rival's actions. Every movement, every glance, every micro-expression was data, evidence of intentions and potential vulnerabilities. After the shipment reached its destination safely, Antoine arranged a meeting with the rival at a neutral palazzo that evening. The room was dimly lit by oil lamps, shadows stretching across ornate walls and reflecting in the dark water of the canals visible through open windows. Antoine arrived first, seated near the hearth, observing the space and noting escape routes, points of observation and positions of influence. When the rival arrived, he offered a courteous nod but no handshake, a subtle display of challenge. Antoine responded with calm acknowledgement, his expression neutral, revealing nothing. "I hear Venice has been keeping you busy," Antoine said softly, his tone even, yet layered with meaning. The rival's eyes narrowed slightly. "And I hear that someone has been moving in ways that disrupt the usual flow. Patterns are changing." "Yes," Antoine replied. "Patterns shift in Venice, but the currents remain. One must understand them to navigate safely." The conversation was a delicate dance, each man probing the other for weaknesses, gauging intentions and testing resolve. No threats were made, yet every word carried weight, every pause was significant, and every glance a measure of power. Antoine spoke of shared opportunities, subtle advantages, and the mutual benefits of cooperation rather than confrontation. He offered no concessions, only acknowledgement and the implication that further disruption would be costly, but in a way that allowed the rival to choose compliance willingly. By nightfall, a subtle understanding had been reached. The rival would continue operations, but within boundaries that Antoine had discreetly set. Influence, not violence, had resolved the confrontation. The Canals, silent witnesses to the exchange, reflected the flickering lanterns as if acknowledging the quiet victory. Antoine catalogued every detail, every nuance of tone and gesture, storing the information for future strategic decisions. Returning to his quarters, Antoine reviewed the day's events meticulously. The first true confrontation had been navigated successfully. Venice's hidden currents had tested him, and he had met the challenge with patience, observation, and precise negotiation. His network remained intact, his influence strengthened, and his rival aware of boundaries without open conflict. As the city slept, Antoine looked out over the calm canals, the water reflecting the moonlight and the soft glow of lanterns. Every gondola, every quiet conversation, every subtle movement was a piece of the intricate puzzle he continued to assemble. Venice was yielding its secrets, one subtle action at a time, and Antoine Morelli was listening, observing, and shaping those currents with quiet mastery. The night deepened, and the city's heartbeat, slow and deliberate, seemed to echo Antoine's own. He knew that future challenges would arise, that unseen eyes would continue to probe, and that influence required constant vigilance. Yet the first confrontation had proven a critical lesson. In Venice, power was accumulated not through confrontation, but through awareness, subtlety, and the patient orchestration of networks. Antoine allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The currents were shifting in his favor. Influence was expanding, and even those who had sought to challenge him were now aware of his presence, careful not to overstep. The city had spoken, and he had answered, not with force but with the art of silence, observation, and strategy. The early morning fog had lifted, revealing the soft gold of sunlight on Venice's canals, yet the city retained its air of subtle intrigue. Antoine Morelli moved deliberately along the quays, his coat brushing lightly against the damp stone walls. The past weeks of observation, strategic alliances, and discreet operations had begun to yield results. His influence was spreading, quietly but unmistakably, through the hidden veins of the city. Today, Antoine focused on expanding the network beyond the immediate canals. He had identified key merchants, gondoliers, clerks, and minor nobles whose cooperation would be essential to consolidating power. Each connection had to be nurtured carefully, with gestures that appeared casual yet carried significant weight in the delicate balance of Venice's underworld. His first stop was a small, dimly lit warehouse near the Rialto market. The space was modest, but the activity inside was anything but ordinary. Crates of spices, textiles, and delicate merchandise were moved with precision, guided by the young gondolier Antoine had trained. Marco Vieri, Antoine's trusted associate, supervised quietly, ensuring that shipments flowed seamlessly while maintaining the appearance of ordinary commerce. Antoine observed the operation from a distance, noting the efficiency, the timing, and the coordination among his team. Each movement, each nod, each subtle signal reinforced the web of influence he was constructing. Today he would expand it further, integrating additional intermediaries who could facilitate shipments, pass messages, and observe potential threats without drawing attention. By late morning, Antoine convened a discreet meeting at a secluded palazzo, one previously selected for its privacy and strategic location overlooking the Grand Canal. Present were Vittorio Bellandi, Isabella Conti, the young gondolier, and a few carefully chosen clerks who managed merchant accounts. Each participant understood the stakes, though none fully comprehended the extent of Antoine's plans. That was deliberate. Knowledge was power, but only when wielded wisely. Antoine outlined new arrangements for shipments, specifying routes, timing and signals to ensure discretion and security. He reinforced loyalty with subtle acknowledgments, a nod, a carefully chosen word, the occasional favor that strengthened trust without creating visible obligation. Every action was calculated to deepen connections, increase reliability, and extend Antoine's influence across the city's intricate network of canals and commerce. Midday brought a delicate challenge. A shipment had been intercepted, not by the authorities, but by a rival merchant attempting to test Antoine's growing reach. Antoine had anticipated such a move. Rather than confront the rival directly, he orchestrated a subtle countermeasure. The shipment continued along a hidden alternate route, reaching its destination on time while sending a quiet signal to his network. The message was clear. Antoine's operations were both flexible and precise, and interference would be noticed without overt confrontation. In the afternoon, Antoine moved along the quieter canals, observing gondoliers, merchants, and couriers as they performed their routines. He noted small irregularities, minor deviations, and subtle signals, each one data to be integrated into his growing understanding of the city's undercurrents. Venice was revealing its patterns willingly, offering opportunities to those who could perceive them. Antoine catalogued each detail, each interaction, each subtle reaction of those around him. As evening fell, Antoine returned to the palazzo for a second meeting. Tonight, the agenda was strategy, not execution. He discussed potential expansions, evaluated the loyalty of intermediaries, and mapped the invisible pathways of influence that connected canals, warehouses, and palaces. Subtle adjustments were made, alliances reinforced, and contingencies planned for potential disruption. The city was alive with movement, and Antoine orchestrated his network with the precision of a conductor guiding a symphony. Night descended over Venice, cloaking the city in shadows and reflections of lantern light on rippling water. Antoine took a solitary walk along the canal, considering the day's operations. The young gondolier approached quietly, nodding in acknowledgement. Small gestures like this, seemingly trivial, were the lifeblood of influence. Antoine understood that power was accumulated not through bold gestures but through a series of subtle, deliberate actions, each one reinforcing the next. By midnight, the network Antoine had nurtured was fully operational across multiple canals and districts. Shipments flowed with discretion, information passed silently between trusted intermediaries, and potential challenges were mitigated through anticipation rather than confrontation. Antoine's presence, though invisible to the casual observer, was felt throughout the city. Venice itself had begun to bend, ever so slightly, to the rhythm he dictated. In the solitude of his quarters, Antoine reviewed the day's successes and identified areas for refinement. Each shipment, each meeting, each interaction contributed to a growing tapestry of influence, a lattice of power woven carefully and quietly through the city. The challenges from rivals had been addressed not with force but with strategy, patience, and precise orchestration. Venice, with all its beauty, complexity, and subtle danger, had yielded its secrets to him, not openly but in whispers, glances, and reflections in the water. As he leaned back, gazing out over the moonlit canals, Antoine allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The web was expanding, influence consolidating, and the city's hidden currents were responding to his subtle guidance. Power was not measured by confrontation or spectacle but by the silent acknowledgement of one's presence and the careful manipulation of opportunity. Tonight, Antoine Morelli had strengthened his position, extending control across multiple veins of Venice's hidden world, and the city whispered its approval in soft, rippling currents beneath the bridges. The canals of Venice were calm that morning, but Antoine Morelli sensed a subtle shift in the city's rhythm. Weeks of carefully orchestrated influence had begun to yield results, yet power was never without its shadows. Whispers reached him through trusted intermediaries. A gondolier had been seen exchanging words with a rival, a merchant had asked too many questions, a clerk had faltered in the timing of a shipment. Small deviations, seemingly innocuous, but to Antoine they signaled the first stirrings of betrayal. He walked along a narrow alley leading to the Grand Canal, the morning mist curling around the stone walls. Each step was deliberate, every glance measured. Antoine's mind catalogued every detail, noting which irregularities could be coincidence and which were deliberate acts. In Venice, as he had long understood, the quietest disruptions often carried the most danger. Influence could be undermined not by open confrontation but by subtle disloyalty, misdirection, and unseen alliances. The first indication of treachery emerged during a routine check of shipments. A delivery that should have arrived by early afternoon had been delayed, routed incorrectly. Antoine summoned the young gondolier responsible, observing the hesitation in the boy's eyes. Carefully, without accusation, Antoine inquired about the deviation. The boy stammered, suggesting external interference, a rival's subtle manipulation of routes. Antoine nodded, noting every inflection, every pause, every nervous glance. Later, in a secluded palazzo overlooking a quiet stretch of the canal, Antoine convened his most trusted allies. Vittorio Bellandi, Isabella Conti, and a few senior gondoliers were present. Antoine's voice remained calm, almost conversational, yet every word was weighted with intent. "The currents of Venice shift unpredictably," he said softly, "and we must adjust to maintain control. Loyalty, observation, and subtle action will guide us." He laid out a careful plan: identify the source of the deviation, reinforce trust among intermediaries, and subtly redirect shipments to prevent further interference. The meeting was deliberate, calculated, and conducted without overt accusations. Each participant understood the stakes, the delicate balance of influence, and the importance of discretion. Venice, after all, thrived on subtlety, and Antoine's approach mirrored the city's own rhythms. By evening, Antoine executed the first steps of his countermeasure. He followed the disrupted shipment through hidden canals, observing interactions, noting unexpected signals, and identifying patterns of behavior among both allies and potential betrayers. Each observation added clarity to the web he had been constructing, revealing not only loyalty but also vulnerabilities, minor cracks in the network that could be leveraged or corrected. The confrontation was subtle yet effective. Antoine arranged a discreet meeting with the gondolier suspected of being influenced by outside forces. He spoke calmly, framing questions as guidance rather than interrogation. He highlighted the value of discretion, the importance of reliability, and the consequences of misalignment with the network. The gondolier, sensing both authority and understanding, acknowledged the deviation and reaffirmed his loyalty. It was a quiet victory, achieved not through threats but through subtle influence and careful navigation of trust. Simultaneously, Antoine addressed the merchant whose inquiries had raised concern. Through careful conversation, he reinforced the benefits of alignment, demonstrating that cooperation with his network would yield long-term advantage. No open confrontation was necessary. The soft assertion of influence, combined with subtle acknowledgement of loyalty and consequence, ensured compliance and reaffirmed his control. By midnight, the immediate threat of betrayal had been mitigated, but Antoine remained vigilant. Venice was a city of currents, unseen and flowing, where influence was both powerful and fragile. Every interaction, every gesture, every decision had consequences, and Antoine catalogued each detail meticulously. The city had tested him, revealing cracks in the web, yet his response had been precise, strategic, and effective. As he walked along the canal under the silvered moonlight, Antoine reflected on the nature of power. True influence was never guaranteed. It was a constant negotiation, a careful orchestration of loyalty, opportunity, and perception. Venice demanded patience, awareness, and subtlety, and Antoine had met these demands with skill. The shadows of betrayal had arisen, yet they had only strengthened his understanding and his network. Reaching his quarters, Antoine allowed a moment of quiet contemplation. The web was intact, reinforced by strategic action, and the city's hidden currents now moved with slightly greater alignment to his influence. Betrayal, he understood, was inevitable in a city of commerce, politics, and secrets, but it could be anticipated, countered, and transformed into an opportunity for further consolidation of power. As the soft ripple of water echoed beneath the bridges and the distant murmur of nocturnal commerce lingered, Antoine Morelli leaned back, eyes reflecting lantern light and canal shimmer. He had faced the first true betrayal of his network, not with force, but with the art of observation, patience, and strategic influence. Venice, in its quiet, intricate way, acknowledged the subtle mastery of the man who had begun to shape its hidden world. Venice awoke slowly under a pale dawn, the first light glinting softly on the rippling canals. Antoine Morelli stood at the edge of a quiet quay, his gaze sweeping across the city he had come to understand in ways few ever could. The weeks, months, and subtle maneuvers that had defined his journey through the labyrinthine streets, shadowed palazzos, and silent waterways had culminated in a network that now pulsed beneath the city's surface like the tide itself, quiet, relentless, and entirely under his influence. The morning air carried the faint aroma of salt, freshly baked bread, and roasting coffee beans from the cafe around the corner. Gondoliers moved silently along the canals, merchants prepared their goods, and clerks began the meticulous work of tallying ledgers. To any casual observer, the city seemed ordinary, unchanged. But Antoine knew the hidden currents, the invisible threads of loyalty, trust, and subtle influence that now flowed seamlessly through Venice. Every shipment, every favor, every whispered acknowledgement was part of a larger design, a symphony orchestrated with precision and foresight. Today, Antoine met with his closest allies in a small palazzo overlooking the Grand Canal. Vittorio Bellandi, Isabella Conti, Marco Vieri, the young gondolier, and Lorenzo Gatti gathered around a long wooden table, candles flickering softly, their light casting elongated shadows against the walls. Antoine's demeanor was calm, composed, yet there was an unmistakable weight in his presence, an unspoken authority earned through patience, strategy, and the quiet mastery of Venice's hidden channels. "The city has spoken," Antoine said softly, his eyes sweeping over the group. "The currents have shifted, but not without direction. Every hand that moves a gondola, every clerk that moves a ledger, every merchant that observes quietly, they all now participate in a rhythm we have begun to shape. Venice has yielded its secrets, and we have aligned ourselves within its flow." He allowed the words to settle, observing the reactions of those around him. Each nodded subtly, understanding both the responsibility and the opportunity that came with their roles. Loyalty had been tested, minor betrayals addressed, and influence reinforced. The network was now strong, interconnected, and resilient. After the meeting, Antoine stepped onto the balcony overlooking the canal. The sun had risen fully now, casting soft gold over the water and buildings. Gondolas drifted beneath him, their passengers unaware of the quiet power shaping the city's commerce and information. Antoine's gaze followed the currents, noting how each connection, each pathway, each subtle arrangement contributed to a greater whole. He reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From his return to Venice, through careful observation of cafés and docks, the cultivation of alliances with gondoliers, merchants, and minor nobles, to the navigation of challenges, betrayals, and rival maneuvers, every moment had been deliberate. Power had been accumulated not through violence or spectacle, but through patience, strategy, and an intimate understanding of the city's rhythms. As Antoine walked along the quiet streets, he noted familiar faces: the gondolier whose loyalty had been carefully nurtured, the merchant whose interests now aligned with his own, the clerk who moved silently through ledgers with precision. Each person, each movement, each interaction reinforced the lattice of influence he had painstakingly woven. Venice was no longer merely a city, it was an ecosystem shaped in part by his quiet hand, its currents flowing according to a rhythm only he fully understood. By evening, Antoine returned to the edge of a bridge overlooking the Grand Canal. Lanterns reflected in the water, rippling gently with the tide. He watched as the city transitioned into night, the streets quieter, shadows deeper, and the subtle undertones of commerce, negotiation, and observation still moving beneath the surface. Antoine allowed himself a rare, private moment of satisfaction. The network was complete in its initial form, resilient and poised to endure. In the quiet of the night, as gondolas drifted silently and the faint murmur of water whispered beneath the arches, Antoine considered the legacy he had begun to establish. Influence, he knew, was not measured by immediate gains or flashy displays, but by the persistent, silent shaping of people, opportunities, and perception. Venice, in all its intricate beauty and subtle danger, now bore the mark of his careful orchestration. He reflected on the lessons of patience, observation, and discretion. Challenges would continue to arise, rival ambitions would test his alliances, and the currents of the city would never remain still. But Antoine Morelli had proven that true power could be built quietly, deliberately, and with an understanding of the unseen forces that governed Venice. As dawn approached again, soft light spilling across the water, Antoine looked out over the canals one last time before retiring. The city breathed around him, alive with quiet movement, subtle communication, and invisible influence. His network would endure, shaped by strategy, loyalty, and the art of silent authority. Venice had revealed its secrets to him, and in return, he had shaped the city in ways invisible yet undeniable. In the stillness of the night, Antoine allowed himself a final thought: empires need not roar to command respect. They need only flow, persistently, quietly, like the canals beneath Venice, unseen, inevitable, and eternal. And in that quiet, shimmering city, Antoine Morelli's legacy had begun.